Hello there! A while back I reviewed one of my favorite FPS games, the original F.E.A.R, for the channel, and now that video has over 1,000 views. So you bet your ass I'm going to try and capitalize off of that with a review of the sequel, F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin. Fun fact about this copy in particular, when I got this a couple years ago, I was not impressed with the condition of the case. It was like one of those instances where you might have had some sticker residue on there that was like pretty much impossible to get off. I think it was like pretty cloudy, like it was well used, let's just say that. My incredible solution to this was to just tear off the plastic of the outside and just take the artwork and tape it on to the case. Prime example of my genius level intellect. And you can even see if you look here that I missed a spot. You can see the plastic right there. And if you open the thing up, yep, there's the tape. It does look shiny though. Anyways, I guess we could get into some gameplay footage now so you don't get too tired of my lackluster stories and homely visage. One last thing, you might want to consider getting something to drink or eat with this one, because it's fixing to be a long one. A little on the lengthy side. Believe it or not, I am here to do a review, so let's get into F.E.A.R 2 now. Let's talk about it. F.E.A.R 2 was released in 2009 for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Microsoft Windows. And as of November 2021, it is backwards compatible on the newer Xbox systems, so I ended up playing through it on my Xbox One. The game was developed by Monolith, published by Warner Brothers, and ended up with a 77% on Metacritic for the Xbox 360 version, which is far from a bad score, but compared with its predecessor's 85% score for the same platform, one begins to get the impression that this game isn't quite as highly regarded as the original F.E.A.R. Eurogamer even went ham and hit F.E.A.R 2 with a damning 5 out of 10, and remarked in reference to the game, quote, "This is so uninspired that you worry for the spark of Monolith's soul." Unquote. Is F.E.A.R 2 really that bad of a sequel, or just game in general? Let's start out with the graphics and presentation and try to figure that out, shall we? If we look at the graphics from a purely technical standpoint, this game is obviously much more visually impressive than the original F.E.A.R. Environments, character models, and most other things all look pretty dang good, especially for 2009. I think one of the most obvious improvements in this game is the environmental variety, something which was definitely lacking in the first game. Here, you'll make your way through secret technologically advanced facilities, a ruined city, and even a dilapidated elementary school, which is probably my favorite area in the game. F.E.A.R 2 does also retain some of the cool visual details that the first game had, like how enemies will react to getting shot in various different ways, such as limping away from you, holding their weapon in one hand and running away, and even getting knocked straight onto their ass by an explosion or shotgun blast. Truly elegant stuff. Despite the improved visual fidelity though, there are some things missing from F.E.A.R 2 that the original honestly did better visually. Probably the most disappointing thing I noticed is how much less hectic combat feels in this game, just from a visual standpoint. One of the most important parts of combat in the first game was how much shit would fly around and get destroyed during firefights. It made the environments feel real when computer monitors would explode or papers would get shredded by gunfire. In F.E.A.R 2, there's just no real consequences for you or your enemies shooting stuff. The collateral damage just isn't really there to the same extent. Also, I honestly think that the lighting was handled a lot more effectively in the first game. If you watched my review, you'll know how I feel about F.E.A.R.'s lighting. It helps build atmosphere, and it also helps you evacuate your bowels when your flashlight runs out of battery. But here, that just isn't really a thing. We'll talk about the actual jump scares later, but there's nothing inherently scary about a lot of the environments in this game, and I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of dynamic lighting. I mean, your flashlight doesn't even have a battery anymore, which I would say subtracts from the atmosphere, but I think it's more indicative of the direction this game decided to take with the horror elements, which I'll talk about a little more later. Also, I can't speak for owners of the Xbox Series consoles, but playing this thing on the base Xbox One will keep you at about 30 frames per second or lower. I didn't notice any game-breaking drops or anything like that, but I thought it was worth mentioning nonetheless. F.E.A.R 2 is a good-looking game from a technical standpoint, at least for when it was released in 2009, but in my opinion, it's missing some of the key visual elements that made the first F.E.A.R stand out so much. Now let's move on to something substantially weirder, the story. Story-wise, F.E.A.R 2 picks up pretty much right where the last game left off, except rather than continuing the Point Man's story, the player fills the shoes of a brand new character named Michael Beckett, something that I personally didn't really care about. I mean, Point Man's a lot more Gordon Freeman than Nathan Drake, but I could kind of understand if some people thought the switch was weird. Anyways though, you start out right around the time that the Origin facility explodes in the first game, which I thought was a cool idea, just because you get to see what the aftermath of what you did in the first game looks like for someone completely detached from it. And then later on, you even get to see how it impacted the civilians around the area. The basic idea of the story is that Genevieve Aristide tricks Beckett into essentially becoming bait for Alma, the creepy little girl from the first game who is now depicted as a grown-up naked lady, so that she can be destroyed or held captive. It's kind of a weird premise, but there were some things about it that I thought worked, like the focus on all of the bad shit that Armachem and Aristide actually do. Not that that wasn't clear in the first game, but it's definitely solidified here. There's a pretty big emphasis on how Alma became the way she is, which is a good thing. And it even kind of makes you feel bad for her, despite her nastiness and nakedness. And speaking of which, yes, the idea of Alma being physically attracted to Beckett is pretty gnarly, to put it lightly. I think if this was established as more of a psychic attraction rather than, physical, that this wouldn't be such a hated plot point for fans. But even with all the weird and gross sexual tension, somebody give her a fucking sweater or something. The most disappointing part of the story for me is how it was presented. I gave the first game a boatload of credit for how its story was presented in my review, and while this game retains the almost constant first-person viewpoint and limited cinematics of the first one, it misses a lot of the subtlety which that game employed. Like, for example, one of my favorite things in the original F.E.A.R that I would not shut up about in my review was how you could learn a lot of background information about the game in real time by listening to phone messages and computer data. This game's interpretation of that was to just make you pick up files and read them in a f***ing PDA. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I call a public display of, they f***ed it up. It just takes a lot of intrigue and intensity out of the experience when you have to drop everything you're doing and read shit in a menu. And for whatever reason, they thought it was a good idea to have your PDA emit this ghastly sound every time you open the f***ing thing. Stop talking! Seriously, the thing never shuts up. I guess they thought that blaring electronic siren noises would make for a relaxing reading environment. Or they just wanted everyone to know what tinnitus feels like. Oh, you bought our game? F*** you, here's tinnitus. Or is it tinnitus? Never mind. Back on topic, I feel like the story really could have shined a lot more if they included something similar to what the first game had. And yes, I'm aware that a lot of other games implement this same system of making you read shit in menus, and that isn't an inherently bad thing. But if we're trying to determine whether this game is a good sequel or not, this is one thing that I feel the original definitely did better. So how about the gameplay? Can F.E.A.R 2 live up to the high standards of the original? Well, let's talk about it. To start out with the basic gameplay and shooting, this game does feel pretty good to play, even when compared to its predecessor. Most of the weapons feel really impactful, and the addition of an actual aim-down sights feature is appreciated. Also, damn, this combat is gruesome, which I do think helps to give your actions a little more weight during combat, especially considering the relative lack of environmental destruction. I'm not sure if the violence in this game is necessarily more pronounced than it was in the original F.E.A.R, which certainly wouldn't be fit for family game night. I think it's mainly just the more detailed graphics that made it stick out more to me in this entry. There's even a couple of sections where you get to use a giant suit of power armor that the replica soldiers, I guess, just left sitting there incidentally in idle mode. Next thing you know, news is gonna come out that their Gmail password is 123, or their birthday or some shit. Wait, do you think that since replicas are technically the same person, they have to share a Gmail account? Anyways, these power armor sections really highlight how gruesome the combat is, as you mow down a metric shit ton of replica soldiers. Honestly, I can see how people would hate that these sections are in here. I mean, it is kind of the last thing you would anticipate encountering in a F.E.A.R game. but I can't lie, I think they're pretty badass. You spend so much of the game as one schmuck against essentially armies of dudes that it's nice to finally get the chance to just mow them all down effortlessly. And besides, the sections don't last that long, and there's only 2. So how about when you aren't in a suit of power armor? Well, let's talk about the weapons at your disposal first. Surprisingly, you really don't have any more options here than in the first game. You start out with a submachine gun, later you find a shotgun, you upgrade to an assault rifle. It all feels pretty much just copied and pasted from the original game. Luckily that means that most of the weapons still feel pretty good to use, except for some reason it looks, feels, and sounds like the shotgun is shooting airsoft pellets. I don't know what the idea behind this was. I mean, it still works well in combat, while being slightly less overpowered than in the first game, for better or worse. Also, most importantly, it will still occasionally evaporate guys into clouds of red, which kinda sounds like a nu metal band name, but at least it still has that going for it. On the topic of shotguns, there are 2 of them in this game for some reason. There's the combat shotgun, which I was just talking about, and then later on you procure the automatic shotgun, which isn't even automatic. You f***ing liars. The only difference between them that I noticed is that the automatic is slightly more effective at medium range, but seems to do less overall damage. I don't know, I feel like I would have preferred a new weapon rather than 2 shotguns, especially when they aren't even that different. I don't think the biggest selling point of the first game was that it had a huge variety of weapons or anything like that, but in a sequel, you usually expect stuff like that to be expanded upon. The only new weapons that I can remember were a shitty flamethrower and a shitty laser. I say shitty because, well, with the flamethrower, it's hard to outright kill enemies with fire in this game. It's more useful for just stunning them so you can take them out with another weapon, making the flame grenades much more useful. And with the laser, it's just this constant beam of energy, and you can't even really tell if it's hurting your enemies or not until they're dead, which just makes it not very fun to use. They're even missing the particle weapon from the first game. There is this gun that shoots balls that turns guys into skeletons too, but it's just not the same. In the first game, I could forgive the lack of weapons because they all felt really good to use and were also practical. And I could say the same for this game, but it's just kind of unfortunate and odd to me that they didn't decide to improve the arsenal at all. Another thing that's a little bit disappointing is that this game feels a little weird to control. It's hard to explain, but it kind of feels like you're moving through water or something all the time, which sounds really awful, and at first it is, but after a while I got used to it and it wasn't such a big deal anymore. I'm kind of interested to hear if that's something that anyone else has experienced too, or if it's just me. Maybe it's just an Xbox or a console thing, or maybe it's everywhere, or maybe it's nowhere, and I'm just crazy. But let me know in the comments if that sounds familiar to you, because I'm kind of interested. Anyways, I just thought that was weird and worth a mention. Since we're on the topic of controls, you can't talk about F.E.A.R without mentioning reflex mode, which is basically a slow motion mode that you can activate for a limited time in order to get the upper hand on enemies. The only difference between its implementation here than in the first game is that enemies are now highlighted when you activate the mode, which I thought was a nice touch. Otherwise, it's just as good as it was in the first game. One of the other hallmarks of the original F.E.A.R is the enemy AI, which seems to be fairly solid here. The bulk of your combat time will be spent facing either these Armacam Black Ops soldiers or the replica soldiers who players will probably remember from the first game. If I said I noticed any difference between these enemy types though, I would be a damn liar. The only possible difference that I maybe noticed is that the replicas are slightly tougher than the Armacam guys, just in terms of their resilience to gunfire. But I wouldn't bet much or anything on that actually being the case. These enemies are fun to fight most of the time, but there are 2 things that seem to let them down and make them seem stupider, as well as a lot less interesting than the enemies from the first game. The first thing I noticed was that in the majority of confrontations, the enemies will be positioned in pretty much the same way. What I mean by that is that you'll almost always have a few guys with assault rifles and submachine guns taking cover and keeping distance from you, while 2 or 3 guys with shotguns charge you and try to flank you. If this was used sparingly, it could definitely catch you off guard and be pretty challenging, but after a while, I started to notice that this would happen in most firefights, which made it a little bit too predictable. The second point I wanted to mention is that the level design is a lot less intricate than it was in the first game. meaning that enemies will almost always approach you from the same direction, and vice versa. One of the great things in the first game was how there were often multiple routes you could take into a combat situation, giving you a chance at a flanking position, an area with more cover, or even a new weapon. This also led to much more detailed encounters between the player and enemies, because the enemies were smart enough to take advantage of these different paths as well, keeping the player constantly on their toes. In F.E.A.R 2 though, you can predict where the enemy will come from much more reliably, and you don't have many chances to get the drop on them to gain an immediate advantage. Enemies will almost always come in waves as well, which only rarely happened in the first game. It just makes things more predictable when you can count on more enemies spawning in almost every time. These two issues, along with the lack of environmental feedback that I mentioned earlier in the review, are definitely drawbacks when comparing this game's combat to its predecessor. But it's definitely not all bad. As I mentioned before, the enemies still seem to be fairly intelligent, and will even kick down desks and bookshelves to make cover for themselves. A new skill that's also available to the player, but I doubt I even have any footage of me using it because it's really not necessary. The enemies will also call out to each other during combat, which gives you some insight as to what their next move might be. Like I mentioned earlier, they also possess a few unique reactions to your attacks, making things slightly more believable. I also enjoyed a lot of the environments that combat takes place in, and there's plenty of cover and space to maneuver even if there aren't varied paths to explore anymore. Perhaps most importantly, the shooting is satisfying and the game feels great to play when it's at its best. Of course, there are a few other enemy types you'll encounter throughout the game, with my personal favorite being these civilians who have been seemingly messed up in some way by the explosion of the Origin facility, leading them to have orange tendrils that can reanimate the dead and also play piano? Don't ask me, I have no f***ing idea. It's completely bizarre, but I kind of love these guys, and they can take a f***ing beating before they finally go down, which kind of makes sense considering you only fight like 3 or 4 of them in the entire game. The invisible assassin guys also make a return from the first game, and they didn't make me shit my pants quite as hard this time, but they could still get you pretty good if you let them. I've been waiting so long to use that clip again. These tiny fast guys also got me pretty good when I first played the game, but if you use reflex mode, they really aren't too bad. Oh yeah, that reminds me. This is like a horror game or something, right? Yeah, there are some jump scares for sure, but I think they missed a lot of the subtlety that the first game had and opted for just jump scares instead. A lot of that comes down to what I mentioned earlier about the lighting, and also the pacing is handled kind of haphazardly. There's a lot less balance between combat and scary stuff this time around, which admittedly can be pretty effective if it's implemented well enough, simply because it's less obvious when something's gonna pop out and make you shit a brick. Generally though, I think the atmosphere was handled substantially better in the first game. So is F.E.A.R 2 a bad sequel? My answer may shock you. No, I wouldn't say it's a bad sequel. Sure, it misses a lot of the nuances and the subtlety that the original game had, but a lot of the good stuff is still here too. And it's also just a lot of fun most of the time, which is probably most important. Is it a great sequel though? No, I definitely wouldn't say that. And in fact, if you couldn't tell, I definitely enjoy the original more. I honestly do think there is enjoyment to be had here though for fans of the original game. If you've never played this thing before, now might be the time to give it a try. Hell, the main reason I chose to review this thing is because it's backwards compatible on Xbox now. And maybe a little bit because of the view count on that first video. Just a tad. But regardless, that could be all the reason you need to go back to this thing and give it a try. And with that, I think I've talked for almost long enough in this video. But before I go, I have to thank each and every one of you for clicking on this video and giving me a chance. As my first F.E.A.R video has gotten more and more attention, more views, more comments, more likes, and more of you have been subscribing and supporting the channel, I've just been so happy that I decided to pursue this YouTube thing. 30 subscribers and even 1,000 views might not seem like much to a lot of people, but the fact that anyone would watch or enjoy what I'm doing means a lot to me. So thank you again for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stuff like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. It would help out a lot, and it would mean a lot to me. Also, leaving a like on this video would help me a lot. I also love reading and responding to all of your comments, so if you have anything you want to ask me or anything you want to say about the review or anything else you want to say, please do so. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, even if you disagree with me. Thanks again, everyone. I'll see you when I see you. Bye.